More notes. Before I turn things over, I would just like to say that Amy is a good friend of mine, and this launch this evening means a great deal to me. I've worked with Amy at the University of Calgary through the Filling Station magazine. I was fortunate to proof this book before it went to the printer. I make this joke about if there's any misplaced commas, those are my commas, not Amy's commas, and I'm dearly sorry. So it's been a real honor to be peripherally involved in this book, and it's a great pleasure to be here this evening. So congratulations, Amy, and really looking forward to it. So I think at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Aritha Van Herk, the wonderful editor, series editor of the Brave and Brilliant series at the University of Calgary Press. So that said, please take it away, Aritha.
Thank you so much, Kyle. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you could join us tonight. As Kyle has said, my name is Aritha Van Herk, and I am the series editor of the Brave and Brilliant literary series published by the University of Calgary Press. We are delighted with this launch to introduce a wonderful new novel, Unlocking, by Amy Leblanc. So I do want to reiterate our thanks to Shelf Life for all their support of the Calgary writing community and the Calgary reading community. Most of all, for their wonderful ability, even in the middle of the pandemic, to fulfill our reading habits. We're so grateful to you, and thank you, Kyle. So now, introducing Amy, one of the leading stars in the Alberta literary firmament. She's already a writing blaze. She's the recipient of a 2020 Lieutenant Governor of Alberta Emerging Artist Award and managing editor at Filling Station magazine. Her first poetry collection, I Know Something You Don't Know, was a finalist for the Stephen G. Stephenson Award for Poetry. And she was a finalist for a 2021 Alberta Magazine Publishers Association Showcase Award for her poem, Well Woman, which appeared in Free Fall magazine. So it is no wonder that this novel promises delight to every reader. Unlocking is a warmly intriguing but disquieting small town mystery, a tangled and disentangled skein of secrets that grow and dwindle and grow. Their riddles unfold in a place called Snowton, somewhere close to Calgary, but far enough away to be a universe all its own. In the labyrinth of a hardware store stocked with hammers and light bulbs and cake mixes, the main character, Lou, does her woodwork, watches her neighbors' disguises, and keeps company with her cat, Magician. From breakups to break-ins, from community turkey suppers to poisonous houseplants, Snowton is filled with wonderfully intriguing ephemera that echo the powerful enigmas hiding in every community, no matter how small, no matter how big. So Amy, thank you for writing such a wonderful novel, and we can't wait to hear you. Amy Leblanc, everyone.
Thank you, Aritha, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you, Kyle, for the lovely introduction as well. It meant a lot for me too to have you working on this book, with you as being a very important friend and just a support in my writing life. So I'm going to read from the prologue and the first chapter of Unlocking. The prologue is the only part of the book that's in first person. So there'll be a shift from first person to third person partway through. And the prologue is also the only time that we get into one of the main characters' voices specifically. So this is Euphemia, who ends up being quite an important character, so it seemed fitting to open the book with her. So this is Euphemia's prologue. 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Who was it that said that? I suppose it doesn't matter, since the one who said it is most likely the first to go. Here's what I've always said. A goldfish will eventually grow to fit the sides of its bowl, and the same is true of secrets. In a confined space, a secret will expand to be as large as the space itself. When the boundaries of the space change, so do the dimensions of the secret. It's basic. When a secret is patiently fed, it begins to grow. An impatient gardener will water too much, fertilize at the wrong time, and pluck their turnips from the soil when they could have grown, with a little patience, twice as bulbous. In Snowton, Alberta, a secret that began as small as a seed was fed until it flourished like a crocus in spring. That isn't to say there was a shortage of secrets before the latest one. Alexander Davies' parents locked him in a tool shed when he wet the bed as a child. Once, while they were planning a bingo fundraiser for repairs to the town library, Alexander was in the shed for 46 hours. Mr. Davy was practicing how he might call bingo numbers. 17, Dancing Queen, 61, Baker's Bun, 85, Staying Alive, while Alexander pulled his last lint-covered piece of gum from his pants pocket to moisten his mouth. I was with Mr. Davy, Alexander's father, when he passed away years after the incident in the shed. He told me that he had only ever wanted to make the boy strong, but I never understood what he meant by that. A clematis cannot grow without a trellis to lean on for support. Mr. Davy himself had been bullied as a child, and he wanted something different for Alexander, who was not present when his father died. He was dealing cards at a casino in Vancouver at the time. Here's another secret. As teenagers, Ben Higgins, Mark Dahl, and Edward Till spray painted Indigo Vince as a slut on the outside wall of the bowling alley, where Indigo used to work to support her mother's drug habit. I only found out because Indigo came to my house for a handful of the polypore pieces I nurtured in my backyard. Generally speaking, most polypores are harmless, but she wanted polypores of the genus Hapalopolis, a species that can cause kidney failure, which leads to fluid retention, confusion, weakness, coma, etc., etc. Indigo thought she might slip some into their soft drinks the next time they came to the bowling alley. I gave it to her, but as far as I know, she never went through with it. A part of me wishes that she had. It would have made for a more interesting year. Even now, Wanda Alpin talks in her sleep and tells her husband that she wants a divorce, but then wakes up with no recollection of having said anything of the sort. Her husband came to me and asked if any of my plants could help her sleep more soundly. It seems that being dumped night after night was beginning to take its toll. I gave him some valerian root to boil with chamomile and suggested he add a teaspoon of honey for sweetness. He never returned for more, so I assume the mixture worked. If it didn't, he may have finally learned how to cope with rejection. Angela Cullen stole $3,000 from the Fund for Flood Relief in 2013. The town council had stapled a milk jug to the telephone pole outside the library to collect donations. Angela was in charge of emptying the jug each night and tallying the donations, but she only wrote down half of the actual amount. The rest went into empty peanut butter jars in her basement. I can't find any reason for that theft other than blatant greed, and I certainly don't blame her for that. I keep all of these secrets like seedlings in my hands. The leaves on my poplar tree have begun turning inside out, and a creeping bellflower has spread itself into the sidewalk cracks in front of my house. The rabbits munch on the blooms and leaves. Regardless, the flower persists and grows. If you try to pluck a creeping bellflower from the earth, you will discover that its roots travel under lawns and fences and even beneath concrete, like a nervous system. Invasive and stubborn, these plants thrive in all conditions. I am alone most of the time, and I speak to my plants to help them grow. Whoever said classical music helps plants germinate and ripen has never spoken to me. My vines wither if I play Mozart, but twist and grasp and climb when I speak to them. I tell them secrets, which they absorb like nutrients from the soil. The earth of this town is ripe with whispers and furtive conversations. The key to understanding is to soak everything in like a bearded iris and to try not to let the secrets turn to rot. I've been skirting around the periphery of Louise Till's secret for some time. I have seen her taking notes as secretary in town council meetings. I see how she separates herself from what she writes. But you don't take on a role like that unless you're at least a little curious about the lives of others. By watching Lou, I have learned that the part of a key that enters a lock is called the blade. What we hold as we slide a key into a lock is called the bow. The shoulder is what keeps the key from getting swallowed in the jaws of a lock. The deepest part of a key's cut is called the valley. The reason my key works at my house and yours does not is that they have different codes, individual delineations that dictate what a key can be used for. A key's valley, shoulder, code, and other features make up the small piece of metal we use for security, a sense of security anyway. I have been observant and patient, as any good gardener should be, but I can sense that the contours of Louise's secret are about to change. And then this is chapter 1. Lou brushed snow from the sides of sloping headstones and jangled the keys on her chain. She knew that the earth was always shifting. Tectonic plates were moving. Earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and volcanoes erupted and shook and submerged. On a level that Lou could witness, the cemetery had gradually begun to slope towards the east. The ground had only begun to shift visibly in recent years, but the headstones had an unmistakable tilt to the left, which meant they had been nudging athwart for some time, and most had begun to bump sides with their neighbors. As she looked at her parents' headstones, their carved edges barely touching, she thought that perhaps this is how tectonics persist. One infinitesimally small shift in the earth and everything tilts out of balance. She took a few minutes and counted the keys in her hands. 42. She counted them again. 42, which meant that she had 166 locked safely away in the store. In her whole collection, she had 12 patterned keys, 99 identical Weiser keys, Schlage keys of various vintages, 3 latch keys, and a number of generic keys that looked almost identical. To the untrained eye, the minute variances between keys are indistinguishable, but Lou was aware of the unique tactility of each and its corresponding house in town. She had been collecting others' keys for the past year and had survived herself with her seamless ability to lie and deceive in order to attain them. She'd imagined fibsters and spinners of yarns as men with ascots and spats, or women in fake fur coats with cigarette holders in their gloved hands. She never questioned that her perception of liars seemed to be rooted in 1920s imagery, and she never imagined that she, of all people, would keep a secret of this magnitude and lie about it so adroitly. After her father's death, she'd inherited his hardware store. When she worked there as a girl, her father used to smooth down her hair to place padded earmuffs on her head before he turned on the key cutter. He guided her gloved hands through the cuts and notches as if metal were no more difficult to cut than butter. Her mother compared the sound of the key cutter to a cat being castrated, but Lou never disliked the sound. She associated it with the controlled pressure of her fingertips against the wing nuts and thumb turns and the smell of her father's cologne. Her favorite part came after the key was cut, and she could hold its edges against the deburring wheel to smooth any roughness away. This was when she felt most involved in the process. She didn't have a machine making cuts for her. She could hold the key against the wheel and feel its harshness filed away bit by bit. If she went too far, she'd need to cut the key again. It was a balance she found of firmness and caution. But now she felt incautious. She hadn't planned to keep anyone's keys, and she'd been blindsided by her own compulsion to do just that. After she inherited the store, her first customer was Frank Blake. He had a new partner and needed Lou to cut a copy of his house key. Lou told him to come back in 30 minutes. She was finishing another project, but she guaranteed that the new key would be ready upon his return. Lou didn't have a plan or even an inkling of what she might do with Frank's key. She just needed to keep it and to keep it secret. When he came back, he picked up his keys, paid, and left, with never any reason to suspect that she had buried a second copy in the storeroom filing cabinet beneath ancient bank statements. Her mother had kept each paper bank statement over the years because she felt that they might be useful someday. In hindsight, Lou could see that her mother was preparing her to take over the store, gathering snippets of information that Lou might need when she was on her own. In this way, Lou thought of her mother like a magpie, She gathered what was needed, kept it safe, and made a home out of a nest filled with string and sawdust. In the cemetery, she tightened her scarf around her throat and breathed in the smell of her well-worn clothing as the wind rolled through town and in between listing headstones. The scarf had been her mother's, but it hadn't smelled like her for a long time. She often thought of her parents and what they might say if they could see her, her pockets full of other people's keys. Lou closed her eyes and heard a whisper, but was fairly certain that she had been the one to speak. Sometimes she was taken off guard by the sound of her own voice. There were days when she didn't speak to anyone until a customer came into the store. She was usually surprised by the clarity of her voice. The one she heard in her head was gravelly, more like her mother's. Nonetheless, she imagined that the wind carried her mother's voice towards her. I've got the key to my castle in the air, but whether I can unlock the door remains to be seen. She liked to remind herself that the cemetery would be here, braced against the wind far longer than she would. These dusty headstones weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Lou walked the perimeter of the cemetery twice each morning. Between 8 and 8:30, a group of men, mummified from head to toe in spandex and elastic, ran around its perimeter. Hi, Lou. Morning. Hey, hi. Hi, Lou. Skip to my Lou. How are you doing, Lou? They each tossed a breathless greeting towards her as they flew past, pumping their arms in time with their legs. Fleece headbands covering their ears against the winter chill. The last greeting came from Bart Hastings, a local writer and the most recent addition to the group, who told her that he'd taken up running to keep his creativity focused and consistent, and to counteract the sedentary nature of his work. She didn't know him well. She had kept keys for him only once, but she knew he wrote mystery novels that occasionally bore a resemblance to events and people in town. No one took issue with this. They all expected that someday he might be the town's claim to fame. Snowton couldn't compete with the Torrington Gopher Hole Museum, where tourists could see stuffed gophers in wedding dresses or gopher facsimiles of early Alberta settlers. Lou had never understood the appeal of the Gopher Museum, but she had spent many afternoons there with her children and her husband. She'd see the runners, she named them the chums, at varying times of the day and in different locations. Sometimes they were jogging, other times they did long, slow variations on lunges across fields, or squats where their backsides almost touched the snowy earth, but they were in a constant state of motion. She often wondered if they ever stopped to eat or drink a cup of coffee together. Her father had never been a runner, but he used to step outside the hardware store to chat when they ran by. He'd stand still, and the chums would run in place, and her father seemed to belong with them somehow. He'd invite them into the store for coffee, which they politely refused, and they'd go on their way. Lou still kept the pot of coffee on and drank 4 to 5 cups of high test each day, but her eyes twitched only occasionally and her heart fluttered with nerves whether she was caffeinated or not. She would try to kick the habit soon. It was just a matter of how soon. She stepped between the cremation urn garden and the in-ground burial plots to pluck a few dandelions that grew around headstones and had somehow survived the first round of winter, even though the odds were stacked against them. Weeds, she thought, were always poking through the soil. Nothing could destroy them. She remembered reading that a woman's mourning clothes used to be called widow's weeds. She wasn't a widow, but she didn't know what to call herself. Adult orphan, remainder, undone. She wiped off mud that caked across familiar names. The cemetery housed only 150 plots. Many of the people from town who died were buried a short drive away in Calgary because their children and grandchildren had left town years before. But everyone who had ever mattered to Lou was buried here. Her grandparents, her aunts and uncles, her old friends, her first baby, and finally her parents, buried in a row overlooking the stream and surrounded by evergreens. The slant of the cemetery ground somehow made the spot more inviting. There was a wrought iron fence that surrounded the graveyard, and one of the latches on the gate had been broken for as long as Lou could remember. There was no shortage of townsfolk who could have fixed it, but it had become a fixture of the Snowton Cemetery's mythology. No one knew where the stories began, but according to legend, the broken latch allowed the spirits of the Snowton Cemetery to wander the town at night, peeking into their old houses, checking up on their loved ones. For the younger citizens, This legend worked to keep them out of the cemetery after dark for fear of encountering the undead. For the older citizens, this legend worked for older citizens, it gave them something akin to equanimity. The cemetery was a silent space, but it was a place Lou felt she could to visit their grandparents' graves, but her children were uneasy about cemeteries. Even at 16, they hadn't outgrown the tendency to believe that everything about death was frightening. When their cat died with fluid in his lungs after drinking water from beneath their front step, Lou thought he looked like he was sleeping. She was the one that wrapped him in a pillowcase, placed him in a shoebox, and buried him in the backyard beneath So sorry, my Wi-Fi just cut out, but I'm back. Where were we? Okay,
Amy, maybe go back a paragraph because it was out
sure.
for a minute.
Was it? Okay. Okay, sounds good. She'd wanted to bring the twins with her to visit their grandparents' graves, but her children were uneasy about cemeteries. Even at 16, they hadn't outgrown the tendency to believe that everything about death was frightening. When their cat had died with fluid in his lungs after drinking water from beneath their front step, her children hadn't wanted to touch him. Lou thought he looked like he was sleeping. She was the one that wrapped him in a pillowcase, placed him in a shoebox, and buried him in the backyard beneath the poplar tree. She didn't pressure her children to go to the cemetery because as a child, she'd been anxious in the same way. She remained so until her grandmother's funeral, when her mother explained that cemeteries weren't places of death so much as they were places of rest. After that conversation, Lou began visiting the graves of relatives who had died before she was born. She found herself in a daily routine where she placed a hand on the top of each tombstone and counted to 3 before moving to the next. Counting quieted her mind, and the palpability of the headstones gave her something concrete to focus on. The cemetery was one of the few places where she could shut her mind off for minutes at a time. She counted the headstones and the evergreens that surrounded her. She picked pine cones off the path and placed them beneath the trees. She'd arrive at her parents' graves with plucked dandelions in her gloved hands, but often bouquets of dahlias and forget-me-nots had already been laid on the grass. She knew that her parents had been well loved, and that should have made the grief easier to bear. But somehow it added to sorrow's desolation. She was never sure why, but her grief took the shape of a yellow clay pot that sat in her body just behind her stomach. When grief overflowed, it poured black over the edges of the pot. When it subsided for moments, the clay pot emptied and she could see yellow again. When she thought about community grief, the pot overflowed more quickly than she could imagine, an outpouring. On this particular morning, she sat down between the headstones and felt the pressure of the stones touch her shoulder blades on both sides. Lou ran her right thumb and middle finger around the space where her wedding ring used to be. She had told Edward the ring was missing. She said it must have slipped off when she was out since the ring was too large for her shrinking finger. She had lost weight in the last year, but Louise knew exactly where the wedding ring was, and she had no intention of retrieving it. Edward came home one day to find Lou on her knees in the garden. She'd been planting lavender, rosemary, dill, and chives, and she'd removed her gardening gloves to work on a particularly tough root with her fingernails. When she finished gardening, she discovered that her ring was neither on her finger nor in the glove. She decided to leave it in the dirt. She read a newspaper article about a woman whose wedding ring had been lost in her garden. She found the ring 13 years later when she harvested her new crop of vegetables and found the ring in the center of a misshapen carrot. The carrot had grown out from the ring so that it looked like a cinched waist. This woman had left her husband years before the ring was found. Seated in the grass, Lou brushed cat hair from the edges of her sleeves and she began to speak. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. She always paused to give time for a response. No, I'm doing well. Really, I am. The kids are healthy. Edward is healthy. Molly has decided she wants to be an engineer, so we're researching universities for her. Stuart still isn't sure what he wants to do, but he'll get there eventually. Lou brushed her hair away from her eyes. The store is fine, Dad. Remember the router you wanted that was on back order? It finally arrived, so I can finish the edging on that hobby horse. Yes, I will, I promise. She traced the edge of his headstone. All right, I'll see you both tomorrow. Lou stood up too fast and was struck with sudden lightheadedness. She'd never run out of words to say so quickly, and she hadn't even said what she'd intended to. She knew they couldn't hear her, but she needed to get certain words out of her head and into the air, and she'd failed to say them. Everyone else knew that she and Edward were separating, but her parents hadn't been told. It reminded her of folklore she'd heard about telling the bees. It was a custom that bees should be informed of important events like births, deaths, general comings and goings, funerals, weddings. If the bees weren't told, they would leave the hive and the honey would dry up. The bees were worthy of respect, and that respect came in the form of stories. Her parents weren't going anywhere. She knew that, but they still deserved to be told about important events, especially related to their own daughter. She hesitated and turned to go, but then returned and placed a hand on her father's headstone, tracing her fingers along the inscription from Dickens. A very little key will open a heavy door. Lou scraped the dirt away from the headstone with her bitten and cracked fingernails and pushed onwards. Thank you.
Amy, that's wonderful. A very little key will open a very heavy door. Wow. Now, I think, Kyle, we can open it if people want to ask questions. I don't know if that's possible. Does
Yes, well,
anybody have a question?
it is possible to unmute yourself if you would like to chime in here. Actually, you know what's great? I find after a reading like this, if we all just unmute for a second and do a quick round of applause.
Woo!
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to do the little heart reaction. Here we go.
So does anyone have any questions they want to ask? I love the chat and I'll save it, but anybody want to ask Amy something about keys? You know what? I want a key cutter. Rereading this book made me want a key cutter. I don't have one, of course. People are shy, or they're putting their comments in the chat. Well, let me ask you one question, Amy, and we won't, if people want to ask them or not. This town, were you thinking about other famous literary towns, or were you deliberately avoiding them?
There were a few that I definitely thought about. Definitely in a totally different kind of tone, thought about Winesburg, Ohio, by Sherwood Anderson, of just a strange kind of eclectic combination of characters. I also read a lot of Alice Munro as I was working on this book as well, so definitely some small town Alice Munro influences. And then some real life towns as well. Like, for full disclosure, I've never lived in a small town, but I'm really fascinated by the dynamics and the politics that can be encapsulated in small town literature. So there were elements too that were based off of small towns that I have family in. For example, my dad has a lot of family in small town Nova Scotia, which is very different from small town Alberta. but I kind of picked pieces that I thought would fit really well to kind of craft this town that would be so strange and so and it was really fun to kind of just take those pieces that worked best for the book.
Well, you'd never know. I think that you grew up in one. Rona Altros has a wonderful question. Did you do research on the plants, or do you just know all that stuff?
It's a little bit of both. I definitely have done research on a lot of the poisonous plants and everything, but I'm also just really fascinated by poisonous plants. And I have a lot of books about them, and I've listened to a lot of podcasts. And someday I want to go to Agatha Christie's poisonous plant garden in the UK. That's on my bucket list. So it's a combination a little bit. It's a lot of research because this isn't knowledge that any of us comes by naturally or shouldn't come by naturally unless we're poisoning people. But it's a lot of fun for me. It's kind of like trivia, plant trivia, to try and see all the different things that I can learn about in that way.
Wow, I didn't know there was a garden of poisonous plants. Crystal Smith wants to ask a question. Crystal, you can just unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, awesome. I'm on my phone, which I've never done before, so I hope you can hear me okay. I was really fascinated by that linkage that was happening between secrets and organic things, or like living things. So the plants and the creeping and the goldfish going to the size of the bowl. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe sort of like the process of doing that kind of associative pattern between things. How do you approach that craft wise, I guess? Or I hope does my question make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really excellent question. Thank you. I think from a craft standpoint, what I really wanted to accomplish, and it took a lot of kind of tries to finally, I think, get it right. But what I really wanted was layers, which I think, especially for kind of shorter form long fiction like a novella, there isn't that much space. So everything has to be so loaded with meaning and with those associations and those connections. And then especially in that opening chapter, I kind of had this image of like the cemetery itself. And I picture these kind of, this isn't the cemetery that's in the book, but I kind of picture a cemetery like Highgate Cemetery or something, where it's this sprawling, beautiful space with these ivy branches and all of this greenery everywhere. And I kind of like to think of narrative in the same sort of way, and that you have these kind of noxious plants that get into everything, and that kind of latch on to something and don't let go. And I hope what I accomplished in the book is kind of that same sort of layering where you have these different tendrils and these different vines that are going in different directions, but they cross over each other at different points. So I hope that answers your question a bit. If it doesn't, totally let me know. But it's kind of a weird combination of everything.
Oh no, that's so fascinating to me. Like starting with the image and then allowing the layering to go. Yeah, thank you so much. That's great.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you, Crystal. Samantha Jones has got a question. Did you find yourself flexing your poetic muscles while writing this work? And if so, how does your experience as a poet influence your fiction writing? These are smart.
That's a really interesting question. These are such good questions. So it definitely, being a poet definitely influences how I approach fiction, and vice versa, I think. I think most obviously for me in the fact that I really like I like things to be tiny. I like to write tiny books. I like to write short poems. Like this book is 112 pages, and even that, it was kind of like, it feels a little uncomfortably long for me. So I think that concision and that, to use Larissa Lai's term, the economy of diction that we all aim for as poets, I think that definitely influences how I approach my fiction, and then I try to go for a less is more approach. But I definitely felt moments where I was flexing my poetic muscles, sometimes a little bit too much. where I have to kind of rein it in because it gets a little bit too flowery and a little bit too abstract. And then I kind of have to go, okay, no, this is a work of fiction. I can have moments where I kind of branch out into that really poetic direction, but then I have to bring it back to like, am I telling a good story fundamentally? And am I telling it in the best possible way? And it's hard to know that balance sometimes. This book went through a lot of redrafting and a full blank page rewrite. And I think a lot of those kind of flowery poetic elements were taken out in that full rewrite because they just weren't serving the narrative the way that they should be. But I have a little secret folder on my computer where if I delete something from one document, I can use it for another one. So I just hang on to them because someday I might want them. So I'll flex my poetic muscles in a different direction sometime, I hope.
Thank you, Samantha. A wonderful question from Sue Hurst. I loved all the secrets in the small town and how they were slowly revealed. Where did the ideas for the odd little secrets come from?
So the odd little secrets, I had a lot of fun coming up with those because I kind of just like, it's like every community kind of has its underbelly in a way, and its parts that we don't talk about. And I kind of just thought through like what would be the most plausible but shocking secrets that could come out of a small community. And then I kind of thought through Euphemia as a character, and I thought, well, what would she be interested in? And it was like, of course, she'd be interested in some family dynamics. She would be interested in anything involving poison. And she would be interested in any kind of greed and any kind of monstrosity that people might exhibit. So those just kind of came to me naturally as I was working on that prologue and really trying to kind of craft Euphemia's voice. And I had a lot of fun with them. So thanks for asking about that. No one's ever asked me about the secrets before. So I love that. Thanks, Sue.
Does anyone else have any questions? I really wish that we were together and we could raise a glass of champagne to you, Amy, but wow, it's an amazing book. So everybody unmute and cheers to Amy for, this is water, but okay. Cheers to Amy. And thank you for a fabulous, fabulous novel.
Here's Ellie.
I hope that,
Oh, and there's Kristen.
cheers.
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 Good job.
Thanks, everyone.
Hooray for Amy.
Hooray. I hope that everyone
Dad.
enjoys this novel as much as I did. And I just want to say, buy it from Shelf Life, or I think that Kyle put the order information in the chat. And I can only say thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And oh, it's just a wonderful book. And it's wonderful to see all your faces. We've missed you. We really have. So cheers. If you want to hang out for a few minutes and talk, I think Kyle will let us stay here. Yeah? Okay.